emphasize, I will give you one more example. See somebody. Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. So what I would try to emphasize is this is a question like sometimes the students ask if I am not doing any experiment or I am not using any new theory to predict something, just by looking at data, how can I find something new? Maybe by just looking at other people's data, I will just find what other people have seen. And the best counterexample of this is the discovery of DNA double helix. If you remember how double helix was discovered, it was the Watson and Crick themselves did not do any experiment. So what they did is they combined patterns which is there from other people's data, like like Rosalind Franklin's experiments had showed that this was a X-shaped pattern. The diffraction image is a X-shaped pattern. The Chargaff rule had said ratio of A by T is equal to G by C. There was the small molecule crystal structures were available, which told the conformation of a nucleotide. So, but each of these people who were individually looking at this data, they were only looking at their data. So the Rosalind Franklin did not think much about Chargaff's rule or things like that same way. So, but now when somebody combines all this data together, that is how the double helix things come. So if you integrate data from multiple sources, you indeed have a way of finding patterns which is not there in the individual data in isolation. And that is what all this data science or machine learning is trying to make use of. And that is what is the, oh, my screen is frozen. Okay. Yeah, so I would skip a certain thing. I would try to give you the last example of how by just looking at pattern in the data you can find new things. Like let us say I will give you a biological question. Let us say there is an enzyme which can take any one of these possible substrate. This enzyme is called acyltransferase. So this can take a malonyl CoA, methyl malonyl CoA, butyryl CoA, propionyl CoA, or things like that. The question you are asked is, given the sequence of an enzyme, you have to tell, is it going to take malonyl CoA or a methyl malonyl CoA? And if it is that, because of which property or which amino acid sequences are governing this specificity, and how you can mutate those amino acids to change a protein which was specific to malonyl CoA to make it a specific to methyl malonyl CoA. So to do that, one of the way you try to do is, if you had a structure of the protein, you try to take all these molecules, you will do what is called docking, calculate the binding energy or things like that. And based on that, you try, but this approach can be difficult quite often. Whereas if you use a data-driven approach, this can be very simple. That is what I'm trying to give you one example. So now what you see is, okay, this protein had 300 amino acids, but I am interested in the substrate binding pocket of this enzyme. So all amino acids, which is somewhere it's on the surface here, that is not important for me. So what is important is only those amino acids which form the binding pocket of the molecule. So if you have 3D structure, it will immediately tell you, like on this one, if you align it to the 3D structure, out of the 300 amino acids, these 13 amino acids, which are shown by the red color, is on the 3D structure. They are in the active site pocket. That is why you are interested in only in this 13. And now here comes the data part. You go to the databases like Swissprot, check each acyltransferase and find out what is the specificity of this one. So maybe you are interested in doing this experiment in Mycobacterium tuberculosis, but don't bother. If the ortholog is there in E. coli, you take it. If it is there in Bacillus, you take it. From all organisms, wherever you have acyltransferase, you pick up what are the 13 amino acid residues and what was the substrate. So if I tabulate this, what you can see here, all these are malonate, and all these here tabulated are methyl malonate, and these are the other substrate. And if you are looking at it, you don't have to be expert. By just looking at it, you see here at this position, what is phenylalanine here is a serine is in, or a glycine is in this set. So what it immediately tells you is that now, because you combined a lot of data, you could discover this pattern. The phenylalanine at this position, it gives it the property to be specifically select malonate. So if you change phenylalanine to serine, it will go to, it can take methyl malonate. And so this is something without doing any theory, without doing any structure modeling or docking or something, you could discover by just using data. And that is what is your machine learning trying to do. And this was a simple example I gave you, how this to make you understand the physical basis, how machine learning is predicting. And this is what, and if you go to the actual 3D structure, you can also rationalize, like malonate means these two positions are hydrogen. And if it becomes methyl malonate, this hydrogen becomes like a methyl group, which is bigger in size. And a bigger residue like phenylalanine here will not be favorable when this one of these hydrogens like becomes a methyl, a more bulkier group. The phenylalanine has to change to another amino acid which is smaller in size, and that is serine. So whatever you get from theory, or you will get the same thing from machine learning or data science, provided you have combined enough data. So that is what is all about. And I would skip these slides, because during this seminar, you would have heard a lot of things about what is machine learning and what is artificial intelligence. So I would skip this slide, and I will try to give you one more example, like how you do so machine learning. Like this is an important concept in machine learning, what is called a feature vector. So every type of data is different. Like the earlier example I gave you is a data which related to a protein. It had a sequence and all these. So features of those data will be different. But machine learning is much more general. It can apply to all sorts of a problem. So let us see application of machine learning to the problem of handwriting recognition. Like as you know, today there are machine learning algorithm, it can recognize the handwriting. If you write 0, 1, 2 or A, B, C, D, it can recognize. But so this can be done in two ways. Like either you make a rule-based method. You say if it is 0, that means it has to be like a circle, or it has to look like an ellipse. But the problem with that rule-based is somebody writes 0, it neither looks like a circle nor it looks like ellipse, because the circle is curved or things like that. So the rule-based method will fail. But the machine learning which uses data is not going to fail, because what it will do is it will take 0, 1, 2, all these numbers written by many different people. So you cover the diversity of all the different shapes which comes into the images. Somebody is writing 8 like this, another person is writing 8 like this, somebody is writing 7 which looks like 1. But if you have the pattern in all that, from this the machine learning algorithm is going to learn how to distinguish this 0 from something else or things like that. And the way this is done is you have to think of converting these machine images into some sort of a machine readable features. So what is done here is called, like, let us say you put a grid around this shape, which is written like here. So it is not very clear whether this is 0 or 6, but if you put a lot of grids like horizontal and vertical lines, now count a box, whether in a box some part of this handwriting is coming or not. If it is not coming, you put it 0. If it is coming, you put it 1. So now what will you see is anything I write here, 0, A, B, C, D, or any alphabet will correspond to a unique set of 1, 0, 0. So 0 will have some certain types of 1, 0 distribution in this feature vector, whereas 1 is going to have a different type, 6 is going to have a different type. So now in the computer, you can compare the strings of 1 and 0. From there, you can find features. And same way, like if you are dealing with a protein sequence, you have to look up a different types of feature vectors. Like the type of, for a protein sequence, the feature vector could be, or like you write a sequence SYP, FDV, GL, MSK. So one simple will be all the 20 amino acid, what is their frequency distribution. Then you can see like, but 20 amino acid, if you just take monomers, it is just telling the composition. I reshuffle SYP, FDV, right, in a different way. So monomer composition would remain the same. So can you think of something else which captures the sequence? So as you do it, instead of just taking monomer, now you calculate dimer. You take SY, YP, PF, like if you are overlapping all the overlapping dimers. Now, if you take their frequency, you find another vector, like all the like there will be 20 different monomers and there will be 400 different dimers, and you will have a frequency. Same way, if you go to trimer, there will be 8,000 trimer. So a protein sequence can be converted into a what is called a monomer, dimer, or tripeptide, like a tripeptide frequency. So then each sequence becomes a unique vector. So if you are taking tripeptide, it will be 8,000 dimension. If you take dimer frequency, it will be 400 dimension. And you can also combine monomer, dimer, as well as trimer. So that is the way unique vectors are made. So this is called how to make a feature vector for a particular type of data. And once you do that, the next step, what you are trying is in this feature space, you are trying to give some sort of a mathematical transformation by which the two types of data becomes different. So let us say I am dealing with the same problem of predicting which is malonate binding protein, which is methyl malonate binding protein. So you give the transformation in such a way that these two cluster differently. And all these machine learning algorithms is trying to do that. There can be support vector machine, there can be random forest, and that is what all they are doing about. So I would skip that. So now if you did that, you have to think of another way. How do you validate? Like before you validate in the experiment in your data itself, you have to think of a way. How do you cross check is your model is correct? That is called the testing or the evaluation phase. So what you do is you don't use all your data to derive patterns. You divide the data into two different halves. Like there is one part is used for training and other part is used for testing. So now the data you are using for testing, don't use it for training. This is what is called a held out data set. And now use that data set to check how many predictions you are doing correctly, how many predictions you are doing incorrectly. And there are many measures like true positive rate, false positive rate, sensitivity, specificity, and you can draw these graphs, and based on this ROC curve or the precision recall curves, you will be able to judge how good is your model. And this is before you go and ask somebody to do experiment to test your model. So these are called cross validation. How do you train a machine learning model? So we would go skip this. So like what I summarized you as of now, this is a machine learning in a very, in one slide you can say. Like what we are trying to say is that you have certain data, you have to distinguish certain pattern, and there can be many different type of patterns of machine learning. One could be a supervised learning, one could be unsupervised learning. Supervised learning is just simply clustering. You can say it can be a linear regression, logistic regression. It is just trying to cluster without knowing what is the label of the data. Whereas in that is the unsupervised learning, is just clustering. And in supervised learning, you have the data labels, like what is malonate binding protein, what is methyl malonate binding protein, or in this case, we are trying to see if I give you a stretch of DNA sequence, is this sequence is going to bind to a particular transcription factor. So is there some DNA binding motif present in this? So if you, that is what the machine learning model is trying to distribute. Initially, when you derive this model, your data is all mixed up. Like that is what raw data, as you can say, your dot and cross are all mixed up. But once you do this support vector or the random forest or any other deep learning technique, so now in the transformed space, so these two data patterns are clearly separatable. That is why you are able to do the prediction. And then you are, of course, doing the cross validation. That is what. So now I would come to this, our particular problem of protein-protein interaction prediction. Like what you are trying to, I tell you, this is like instead of like a drug design which targets a single protein, what is happening is you have a drug like a kinase, and let us say this is ATP which was binding to the kinase, and that is how the kinase was functioning. Now you are designing in many cancer drug, you know, these are ATP analogs. So this inhibitor comes and binds at the same site where ATP was binding. So this protein is now, that is called inhibited. It is not able to bind to ATP. It is not functioning as a drug. And that is the single molecule. This is the kinase and that example. But in contrast to that, the protein-protein interaction inhibitor rings in the natural process, the protein A is binding to protein B. And now you designed a molecule or an inhibitor which goes and binds into this cleft which is present in protein B. And this cleft was actually filled by something which was bulging out of the interaction partner A. But now this inhibitor you designed is binding to this cleft with high affinity. So because of this designed drug B complex is more stable. So A is not able to bind and the downstream processes are not working. And that is how you can make molecules. This is what I have meant in my title of the talk. How do you design modulators of protein-protein interaction? These modulators, what I mean is small molecules which can bind to one of the interaction partner and inhibit the process of interaction between A and B. And this has several advantages. It has a more specific inhibitor, this one, and there is a reduced chances of affecting the paralogs, and it has a more specific in that interface area is much larger. And in many cases, you can use peptides, because the protein, when there was an interaction between A and B, the polypeptide of A, stretch of A was interacting with polypeptide of B. So you can straight away look at the sequence of A and try to design a peptide stretch, which will small peptide stretch, which will go and bind here. So it is very easy to design peptidomimetics by this approach. And there are many areas in cancer, in development of antivirals, the PPI inhibitors are being used as drugs. So that is why people are, the interest in drug discovery is now shifting from single molecule targets to the PPI targets. So now going to this one, like the question what we have here is like, now what is the goal? Your goal was like you have a protein-protein the interaction and this one. So how do you inhibit it? And this is where the different techniques of drug discovery comes into picture. Like there are, if you would have attended some drug discovery talks earlier, so there are some type of methods which are called structure-based methods. And there are some type of methods which are called ligand-based methods. So like what is the structure-based methods? That means you need the 3D structure of the ligand, of the receptor as well as the ligand, and you are using a modeling the structure of a protein ligand complex, and based on that calculating energy. That is the structure-based method. In contrast, in ligand-based methods, you may not have the structure of the receptor, or you may not even know what is the receptor. You are working on a molecule which is working on a cell line and telling you it is killing the virus or the bacteria or not. So here only ligand features are being used. So these are called ligand-based methods. So pharmacophore-based method or QSAR, quantitative structure activity relationship, comes under this category. So same way, the PPI inhibitors can also have structure-based or the ligand-based methods. But in contrast to these methods, the machine learning is a different method, which can be a ligand-based or it could also be structure-based. Like it is only so if you are using only ligand features, it is a ligand-based method. You can use some structural features in constructing your feature vector. It can be a structure-based method, or you could combine the features of both structure, ligand-based as well as the structure. I will give you examples after that. So now this is what I explained you already. This is the pharmacophore modeling is a ligand-based approach, or a QSAR is a ligand-based approach. So in contrast to that, like a structure-based drug discovery, here you are trying to use, you need the 3D structure, you are trying to use docking, and here you require a scoring function which can accurately evaluate what is the interaction energy between the protein and ligands. So now there are many different types of scoring functions. So we will not go into these details. Like the specific questions, let us say we are trying to, we are interested in making drugs against Plasmodium falciparum. So there are many compounds which have been tested at a cell line level, and it is known that they can kill Plasmodium falciparum. There are many such compounds, 13,533 compounds from GSK, and all have already been released. And a smaller set of these are more curated, what is called the MMB box. These are a set of compounds which are known. These are known as antimalarial. But the question here is, what are their targets? And if you know their targets, then you can use these compounds as the starting point and design more better inhibitors, which you can make some modification into some of these groups, then you can, but the targets for these molecular compounds, even though you know them to be antimalarial, you don't know their targets. So by using some of the drug discovery techniques, if you can predict what are their targets, then you have a way. So now, if you do that, so what I would give you one example is, so let us say you did docking. That means then I take this example of PPI inhibitor from this earlier I gave you, this is autophagy associated complex ATG8, ATG3, and the crystal structure was available for ATG8, and instead of whole ATG3, the part of ATG3 which was binding to ATG8, that peptide structure was available in complex with ATG8. So now what is our goal? We have to design small molecule which can go and bind here and to the ATG8 so that ATG3 cannot bind. And to do that, if you use the conventional drug discovery techniques, you will use what is called docking. Like that means you take this entire compound library of 13,000 compounds, make each of them bind on the binding site, calculate the energy, and based on that, you are going to say which compounds are better binder. If you do that exercise and put a cutoff of anything which gives you energy less than -7 kilocalorie, you get a list of 162 compounds. Even 162 is very large number. I cannot, if I draw all of them on the slide, you will not be able to see it. So what is called like compounds which have similar groups can be clustered together. And in drug discovery or chemoinformatics, what is used is something called a Tanimoto score. The Tanimoto score is something like your sequence similarity score. If two proteins have identical sequence, you will say they are 100% identical. If there are few mutations, they are 99%. If there are many mutations, they are 70%. Same way, Tanimoto score would become 1 if these two compounds are exactly identical. If it is 0.4 or less, that means the scaffolds are very, very different. So if you do compare at this level using a Tanimoto cutoff of 0.4, you find these 162 compounds are going to 19 different clusters. So as you can say, based on docking, you identified 19 different scaffolds which can potentially inhibit ATG8 and ATG3. So this is what you will do if you use the structure-based methods. And what you are doing here is now it is telling you how it is inhibiting. This is how the ATG8 complex was given here. It is in this gray colored thing. And here that yellow color one is the ATG3 peptide part is shown here. And now this in the other color magenta or something which is shown here is the small molecule is going. If it is occupying this site, then this peptide cannot occupy. So the docking is giving us, it has all the advantage. It tells us where it binds, how it binds and all this. But the main difficulty with this approach is when you are calculating this energy, and we don't have that good scoring function which can really predict molecules. When you take these molecules, go and test in the lab, you can find it is going to bind or not. That is the major drawback of the docking-based approach. And this is where a machine learning-based approach can help us more. And we will try to apply how can you develop a machine learning-based approach for predicting protein-protein interaction inhibitor. So what you require for developing any machine learning-based method or a supervised learning-based method is you are trying to find properties of the molecule which based on which you will say this molecule is a potential PPI inhibitor and another molecule is not. As I told you, machine learning requires data. That means to start with, you require data which is going to tell you this molecule is actually a PPI inhibitor and another molecule is not a PPI inhibitor. So where do you get this data? Like I told you, your protein structure data is in the SwissProt. There's a proteins in PDB, the sequence data in SwissProt, the nucleotide sequence data in GenBank. So there are IPPI, PPI-DB, and there are databases where we have information about different types of protein-protein interactions and which molecules are likely to inhibit them. And if you go to these databases and as you find here, these are the different types of PPI complexes for which you have the inhibition data. That means for each group, you have small molecules, like which small molecules inhibit these complexes. Like what is shown here is like RBD-SE2. This is the example from SARS-CoV virus I gave you. This is the data set we have compiled in our lab based on a experimental information which was published in bioRxiv by certain group. They did some experiment by which they screened a lot of compounds, and based on that they found, okay, these are the compounds which are inhibiting the RBD-SE2, these are the compounds which are not inhibiting. Same way, for each types of protein-protein interaction, you have different type of data, and the statistics is shown here. Now, but to do a machine learning, what you can say here, these are only positive data set. Like any compound which is in this set, okay, I know that this is a compound which is actually an inhibitor of a protein-protein interaction. But if I have to develop a model which will tell, given a molecule, it will tell me this is a PPI inhibitor, this is not. How do I know this is not a PPI inhibitor? So if you remember, I gave you the example of a kinase inhibitor. So if you take a molecule which is an inhibitor of kinase, obviously it is an inhibitor of a single molecule. This is not a PPI inhibitor. So now you can go to these databases and try to look for molecules which are like whatever. You can go to the ChemEMBL database, and this is the example I already gave you. So we searched for PPI dataset and got 2,575 molecules which can be potentially PPI inhibitor. But where do I get negative data which are not PPI inhibitor? So we went to the ChemEMBL dataset, which is where we looked for molecules which are only known to be inhibiting the single proteins. It may be inhibiting a kinase, it may be inhibiting a particular enzyme, or it can be some receptor on the cell surface or ion channels, or it can be inhibiting a transporter. So these are the chemical compounds which are inhibiting what are shown here, the single protein. So this becomes our positive data set, and this becomes our negative data set. And to reduce like two molecules, there can be, because you are combining from a database, you may have the same molecule inhibiting two different proteins or things like that. So there will be redundancy. So this was clustered at a Tanimoto coefficient of 0.9. That means something above 0.9. That means these two chemical structures are very, very similar. One small, like moietic methyl group or a hydrogen is differing. So if you cluster it, you got this data set of this reduced to 1324 positive, and same way you pick the equal negative data set. And as I had told you, to develop a machine learning model, you need to develop what is called a training data set. That means from this data, you will derive your prediction rules, and what is called a validation data set. In this data, when you are tuning your prediction rule, you will test it on this. If the prediction is bad, you go back to it, and again, you reiterate on it. That is what the model, train model, repeat, evaluate model. So these two parts are done on the training and validation data set. And once you are convinced that, okay, you have your model is predicting well, then you can come to this test data set, which are called held out data set. On this, you test what is the performance, and that is what you report, saying that this is the performance of your machine learning model. And a subsequent experimental test comes much later. After you say that, okay, on all the known data, this is your performance, somebody else can take this model and then test it, actually do an experiment to check the molecules you predicted are PPI inhibitors or not. So, and in this particular case, what I would say is the random forest machine learning was used. There can be many different types of machine learning. Some people use deep learning, some people use support vector machine. In this case, what I am talking, the random forest was used for training. So now, the way I gave you the examples of PPI inhibitors, like when you converted into feature vector for your handwriting recognition, you put them on the grids and got 0 and 1, that was your feature. For your peptide sequence, it was the monomer composition or the dimer composition. Same way, what would be the feature vector for any molecule which is a PPI inhibitor or not? So one can think of different features, like all these different chemical structures are having different properties, like which are the types of bonds are there, what types of atoms are there, or which are the, how many hydrogen bond or donors are there, how many acceptors there, what is the log P value, molecular weight, how many aromatic rings. So these are physicochemical property based descriptors. So any molecule comes, what you do is you calculate all these features. So here So basically, they're different physicochemical property, and you make a feature vector out of it. So it will be like all the dimension of your vectors will be whatever number fields which are shown here. And for each field, you will get either a 0 or a 1 or a number or a fraction or things like that. So that becomes your feature vector. And using this feature vector, so now what you are going to tell you is like you will do train a machine learning model. And after you train a machine learning model, you are going to draw what is called a ROC curve, receiver operator characteristic curve. So why is this word receiver operator characteristic curve has come? This is actually come from World War time, when during the Second World War, when they were seeing the blips on the radar screen, the operator has to distinguish, is it a genuine enemy aircraft or it is a false signal. So this is the type of ideas and the curves had been used at that time. And that is how it basically, it is a pattern recognition technique. You have to tell this pattern is correct pattern or it is a false positive. So now that is what is done here. So in all sort of predictions, and even somebody is trying to tell if you have got malaria or not based on your blood profile prediction, also use this type of curve. So this is all they plot on one axis is a true positive rate, and on the other axis is a false positive rate. So what would be the perfect prediction? That means you will have a 0 false positive rate and a 100% true positive rate. So this curve will look like a rectangle. So how is this curve is going to change? So let us say you had a cutoff, you got a score above this cutoff, you are telling it is true positive. In our case, it is a PPI inhibitor. You got only 20 molecules from your data set were predicted as PPI inhibitor. So now you relaxed the score a bit. So what will happen? So instead of 20 molecules, you will get 30 molecules which are PPI inhibitor. But by doing this, you are making a compromise. When you are going from 20 to 30, maybe 3 out of those molecules are not PPI inhibitor. Just because you relax the score, it has become this one. So that is how now, as your true positive rate is increasing, you are also increasing the false positive rate. And if you relax the score completely, everything without bothering at the score, you will reach this end of the rate. You will predict a 100% true positive and a 100% false positive. So prediction at this point is meaningless. So what should be done is, ideally you should choose a point like here. You are going to get a 80% true positive prediction with a 20% false positive prediction. So what this means is, more convex this shape is the better. If you can get a perfect prediction, of course, this is a rectangle, which you never achieve. But more convex this graph is, that means at a higher true positive, you are getting lesser false positive. That means this curve is rising very sharp. That is what is important for you. So that is how this performance is measured. And if you did a random prediction, like you don't bother about the score, and randomly say, so your AUC will become 0.5, this will become diagonal. At every value of the score cutoff, you have equal chance of telling whether it is positive or negative. So this is the random prediction line. So any AUC value, this is called area under the curve. So if it is a perfect prediction, AUC is 1. If it is a random prediction, AUC is 0.5. Anything between 0.5 and this is the number you are interested in. And how is this true positive and false positive is calculated? So if it is actually a PPI inhibitor, you predict it correctly, it is called true positive. And if it is not an inhibitor, you predicted it as your model is telling it is inhibitor, you call it false positive. Same way, you can calculate it as a true negative and false negative. And based on that, all these can be calculated. So now, if you did that, what you find here is your AUC curve is looking like this. It is giving you area under the curve of a 0.5. And this is usually done what is called n-fold cross validation. Or like this is again, you learn in machine learning, all these things, like what is leave one out. That means all the data is used in training, only one data is used for testing. So that means you have used all the data. So that is where you are getting best prediction, which is not a good scenario. But when you try to predict in a real life, you will not have this model will not perform well. So it is better. So n-fold cross validation means you use and divide the data into n halves, like 10-fold. You divide the data into 10 equal bins. 9 part of them you use for training, 1 part you use for testing. This is called 10-fold cross validation. If it is 5-fold cross validation, 4 parts of the data you will use for training, 1 part you will use for testing. So this is 5-fold. Same way, the best would be 2-fold. That means you are only using half of the data for training and the other half for the testing. And as you see here, so what are your AUC values is it was good when you got leave one out, it was 0.81, and when you use less data for training, that has reduced 0.77. But the problem with this model is with a, let us say, with a 80% true positive rate, you have to go to almost 35% false positive rate. So that means based on this, the physicochemical properties as features, we are not able to develop a good machine learning model for PPI inhibitor. So what can we do? So we have to think of a more complex features. So why I am telling this slide is this was a paper in Nature in 2008. So now chemoinformatics has developed so much that you can even predict on the computer. You give somebody a molecule, a structure of a molecule, you tell how it is going to be synthesized. So now using machine learning and chemoinformatics, these computational models can tell all the different of the synthesis steps, which chemists were usually doing. So they use more complex features. And when this was published in Nature, there was a commentary. These results indicate now and in future, chemists can finally benefit from in silico colleague that constantly learns, never forgets, and will never retire. So this is telling us what is the power of machine learning. So if we are able to do this well for predicting the routes for chemical synthesis, can we do something that our prediction models for PPI inhibitor improves? And that is where we thought of using more complex fingerprints or the like a feature vectors. That instead of feature vectors being very simple physicochemical properties, this is another feature vector, what is called a Morgan circular fingerprint. So some of you who are known who have been in chemoinformatics, you will know, though it looks complex, the people who developed have done the difficult task. For you, it is very simple. Download the RDKit package and just pick the Morgan circular fingerprint, it will calculate. So what it is doing is that instead of a physicochemical property which has no information about the connectivity of the molecule, here it is keeping track of connectivity. So you center your thing on probe on any atom, then check at a radius of 0, which are the atom itself. As a radius of 2, that means the one bond in between, which are the other atoms, what is their property. At a radius of 4, that means 2 bonds on either side, which are the other atoms, what is their property. So you can use what is called a Morgan circular fingerprint, and this is sometimes called its extended connectivity ECFF fingerprint with a different radius. So if you do that, what you will find is your fingerprint is much more complex. You represent in your feature vector more complex features about the molecule, about your molecule, and how different moieties are there, how they are connected, and things like that. If you did that exercise, what on the same data set, what I had showed you earlier, as you can see here, your AUC values like these curves have become more steep. And now if you draw a line here, 80% true positive, what I am saying is I am having less than, this is 10%. At a 5% false positive, I am able to do a 80% true positive prediction. If you remember, if you go to this graph here, so at a 80% false, I was going to 35% false positive. So that is how, based on the AUC value, I can say this model, which we got by using the Morgan circular fingerprint. And here I didn't have gone back to that slide, that right panel is that thing. So this curve is much more steeper. The AUC values are much more higher, 0.81 versus 0.93, 0.77 versus 0.8. You are doing a much better prediction. So, and this is something really very good. So that means you get a large compound library. You can quickly screen those compound library to find which are potential protein-protein interaction inhibitors. And this is what, and now the other question you try to ask is when you are picking the protein-protein interaction inhibitor, are you picking really molecules, new molecules with different scaffolds, or you are picking only those molecules which you have used in training? And to do that, so all these predictions are evaluated on what is used as a TSNE plots. Like if you have a very complex data, it is essentially something like a principal component diversity, how well you are representing the diversity of the data. So we took a group of things called ChemDiv library, and using the ChemDiv library, as you see, this pink color point shows the total diversity. And the compounds which are training set, what was used in the training are the red compounds. They were here, they were clustered. But the predicted compounds are not really clustered. They are not close to the red ones. They are all scattered all over. So that means this machine learning model, it is not that it is just selecting molecules of a particular scaffold. It is selecting molecules from many different scaffolds, but despite that, it is able to identify the features which are important for PPI inhibition. And now the question here is, but up to this point, what you have tried to address is it a PPI inhibitor or not? By not means it is a inhibitor, probably it is an inhibitor for a single protein. But there are different classes of PPI. There are 24 different classes of protein-protein interactions we know of now. So can you tell to which class it is? Can you specifically design now? So now you can think of a hierarchical prediction model. Like you first predict, is it a PPI inhibitor or not? In the next stage, you try to make a family-specific predictor. So this is what this is what you are trying to, out of all the set, this molecule is going to inhibit this particular protein family, and the protein families are listed here, like a BCL2-like, or it is a bromodomain histone type, or a CD4-GP20 type, or a KEAP NRF2 type, or like this one. So out of this, the model can tell, no, this is a KEAP1 NRF2 or something else, it's a RAS SOS1. So these are the protein pairs to which it is actually inhibiting. So now you need to develop, you would have to use the same approach of machine learning, but your data has to be trained for each types of PPI pair. You have to train the model separately. And now what is going to be the negative data set here? In your earlier case, you are trying to tell your positive data is a PPI inhibitor, negative data is an inhibitor for a single proteins. But in this case, your negative data could be an inhibitor for like something which is the positive data for BCL2 like can be a, it is not going to, it is specific for this group. So it is not going to inhibit bromodomain or CD4 or KEAP1 NRF2. So when you are developing a classifier for this group 1, all other groups can be used as negative set. Same way, when you are using for RAS SOS1, these 40 will be your positive data and remaining can be your negative data. So if you do that, so now by using the similar approach, I will not go into the details. You will be able to develop predictors for each class, like bromodomain histone, BCL2, like all the classes, and including RBD, HSE2 or that something. But one potential limitation of this model is when I developed the generic PPI predictor, we had many more data points. Like here, because this data is limited for some classes, you have only 18 examples. So what we restricted is you should have at least 20 or more examples to define a class. If it is less, we didn't use it, but a limit, the availability of data is a potential limitation for this developing this class specific predictor. But nonetheless, the predictors we developed are there, look really stiff curves. The AUC values are good. And there are other parameters which we have used, which are called precision recall or things like that. In terms of that, these are good predictors. So as of now, what I have showed you is by using this data, which is available in public domain on PPI inhibitor, we have been able to train machine learning models which can successfully predict modulators for PPI. In this, we have not done any docking or anything as of now. So what your docking or ligand-based methods was doing, a machine learning method is able to do all that and probably better than that or things like that. So now we tried to ask this question, like now that we developed this one, and this was the time when the SARS, everybody is interested in finding inhibitors for SARS-CoV-2. So we tried to use this predictor to search, like there are diversity library and you can find many scaffolds which can probably potentially inhibit the RBD-SE2 interactions. And the way they are inhibiting, like all these points, you did not use any structure. Like what it is telling you is here, it is telling you this is the complex between RBD and SE2. Now let us say the cluster 87 is a group, is one cluster which came out of your machine learning, which is inhibiting it. So what is happening here is, like there were some specific residue, glutamic acid and tyrosine, with which some part of SE2 was interacting. This the blue colored one is the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, and this is to SE2 protein. And these were really specific interaction between like a glutamine and lysine, histidine and tyrosine, and that is how this complex was stabilized. Now what is happening is that this molecule, small molecule which you designed, is going and binding at the same site and interacting with this group, and that is how SE2 is not able to bind. So now what I am showing in this slide, this has come from docking. So what you are doing is, you have a large compound library. Doing docking for each of them is compute intensive. You will not be able to do all of that. So filter it with a machine learning method and do a smaller set of selected compounds, and using that you can do docking, and then you will have a rationale for why this is inhibiting or not, and you can design more better compounds along these scaffolds. And now, the question what we wanted to ask is machine learning is doing better than docking? So what is shown here is like the performance of a machine learning model here compared to like the docking based model. So as you can see here, the ROC curve, like, or a AUC value of a machine learning is 0.9 and the docking is 0.5. It's almost close to random. So the reason for that is there are many types of, these are really small molecules, and so you can have many different molecules. Your scoring function is not able to properly distinguish between binder and non-binder, whereas machine learning is able to do that better. And the reason for that is what is shown here is the score for the binder and the score for the non-binder, and they are almost overlapping. But one thing you have to understand is docking is something which did not use any of the experimental data to train it, because the docking Autodock or the Schrodinger is developed on some other system, and your SE2 RBD, it has no data on SE2 RBD. But whereas in this machine learning method, you used some amount of data on RBD SE2 to derive this model. So this is a data-driven model. It is using some experimental data for training. That is why it is doing better than docking. So that is what the point I wanted to make. And all the things I discussed here is this is essentially summarized in the flowchart. We took many different types of PPIs and we designed these fingerprints, and based on that, I showed you the result of random forest. So, and all these calculations are done using the Weka package, which is free and downloadable. Anybody wants to do, repeat it. And there are many other machine learning models like you can use deep learning, you can use the support vector machine or naive Bayes or something, and anything you use, the results are very similar, so it doesn't change. In fact, random forest with this fingerprint probably gives the best result. And there are 11 class-specific predictors which they cover different disease protein families. Many of these are associated with cancer, but one of them also happens to be RBDHSE2, which we have tried included to this step. So, and in the next step, in the step, once machine learning predicts it, in the next step, you can probably do docking to identify where it is binding and how it is inhibiting. And this one is this entire scripts and all the data set, sorry, is available for download from our website. If somebody wants to repeat, one could repeat the calculation or test it. In addition to that, if you don't want to download, this work has been recently published in Briefings in Bioinformatics. And this is, and Priya Gupta is the student who has done all the work. But in addition to this publication had only downloadable script. But if you want to do this on our web server, you can really paste the what is called the SMILES code for any compound or a set of compounds, and it will, you select the machine learning model, it will go through all the steps and it will predict which compounds are likely to be PPI inhibitor or which class and all this. And Manish has developed the web interface for the SMM PPI. So all that I talked for PPI inhibitor is available on the website. It will be shortly available, but the scripts are downloadable from here. So now this is I gave you the example of this PPI prediction from this one and the SARS-CoV-2. And same way, you can apply it for any system, any other system. You can apply for Plasmodium, you can apply for other thing. Of course, only experiments are future going to tell how good is this predictor. So I had some slides on Plasmodium. I would skip them. So what I would try to go is tell you in next 1 or 2 minutes before we go to the question answer, what are the limitations of the machine learning model I talked about, which is important. So as you saw here, I have not used any feature which is the property of the receptor. I have only used the ligand-based feature. So if you go to the drug discovery, it will be still called a ligand-based method. Instead of a QS type or QSAR type of model, we are using a machine learning model. So it improves your prediction, but it doesn't use any of the receptor features. And interpretation of prediction is really difficult in absence of molecular basis. Like sometimes some of these molecules may not be binding at the actual interaction site. They may be binding at allosteric site and still working as a PPI in modulator. So this is not captured in this model. So that is what interpret. So this is true for any machine learning. So or AI based method, interpretations are already, because this is based on a pattern which is present in your data, which is predicting, and that pattern can be indirect and sometimes it could be misleading. And that is why newer things called like interpretable AI is very important. So you need to, and as I showed you during docking is, after machine learning, if you do docking, you can rationalize some of it, but you need better methods. And now, in contrast to structure-based methods, when you know how a molecule is binding at a particular site, now you know here there was a hydrogen. If I change it to a methyl group, the fit would be better, or I put a positively charged group, it will bind better. Because it is not interpretable, in the current form, the machine learning it is good for quick screening of large compound library and getting a potential hits, but it is not good for the drug design. So one has to think of, and inclusion of structure-based features and advanced deep learning techniques can help in getting over some of the limitations which I highlighted. So what are these ligand-based methods which some of us we are trying to do currently in the lab? These are called extended connectivity, the interaction fingerprints. Like what I showed you, we used only the property of the ligand to derive the fingerprints, but we did not use any protein features. And what this schematic is doing is, it is trying to check this moiety HN group was interacting with hydroxyl from the receptor. This was interacting with this pocket. Based on that, some property of the receptor can be encoded into the feature vector, and that will take care of the receptor structure, and that can improve the prediction. This is some of this. And there are other things. There are many other models people have developed, like NN score, RF score, and all. These are the ones which try to use machine learning, but their features are not chemical structure like this one ligand-based features alone. In addition, they are structure-based features. So some of these can potentially improve the prediction, but they need to be tested. And that is what is shown here. These are the like ECA, extended connectivity fingerprint, or structural interaction fingerprint. These are newer fingerprint which can give you structure-based features, and a combination of structure-based and a ligand-based can potentially improve. But in addition to that, people are also thinking of using information of genomic background of cell line and other things, like or even what is called, you might have heard about L1000 map or something. So they have transcriptomic profile in presence of different ligands, like in cell lines and things like that. So in addition to that, if those features are used, now you have more data which is used for drug discovery, and that is probably going to improve the predictivity of your model. So this is the summary of what I talked to you today. So we have developed SMPPI, which is a machine learning algorithm to predict potential PPIM modulators out of any given compound library. family specific predictors have been derived for 11 clinically important families, and SARS-CoV-2 RBD is one of them. And as a test case using SMPPI, so we have predicted some molecules for RBDSE2. Of course, on what has to be tested, then only one knows. And I didn't talk about the results on Plasmodium. So this is essentially the talk, and I should thank my institute, Director NII and Department of Biotechnology through their BTIS work for funding. And this work is mostly, the entire part of the work is carried out by Priya Gupta. So I would stop here and take questions.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty, for such an...
Shall I unshare it, or I will keep the sharing on?
You should, like, you can keep it if like somebody wants, like...
Okay, sure.
Again, go back.
Sure. Yeah.
So thank you very much, sir, like, for introducing us to the field of machine learning and its role in prediction of small molecule modulators for PPI. There are a couple of questions from the participants, and I will...
Sure.
Yeah. So like there is a question from Aminul Manin, whether the structure in PubChems which are available, are they not energetically lowest?
The structure in
PubChem, sir, PubChem.
PubChem.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, the structure which is available in PubChem, it takes from different sources. So it is certainly, you will not be, because in the context of that experiment, they would have said which molecules are binding to a particular protein and which one is the best. So the interpretation of lowest will be only in the context of those 3 or 4 compounds or 20 compounds they have included in that study which reported it. Obviously, they have not tested it vis-a-vis the other compounds. Somebody else would have reported another study which is giving you better binding affinity or things other than that. So that is why when you combine all this data, and let us say you take everybody else's data and then to compare, so they would certainly not be energetically lowest. Okay. Your audio is mute, sir.
Yeah, so there is another question. While we are disrupting interactions between, say, like A and B, the inhibitor should either target A or B, or both are fine?
Yeah, inhibitor could ideally target both, but that is primarily decided by seeing where there is a cleft, or like in many of the protein-protein interaction, the 2 partners could be more rigid, but in some cases, one partner is rigid and another partner is flexible. It is adapting its structure to fit to the rigid partner. Like let us say you have a kinase, it is phosphorylating another protein. So the substrate of the kinase is actually flexible. So in that case,
my video also.
Pardon?
No, so like you can carry on. I just got a call actually.
Yeah.
From
Okay. So somebody else was saying something. Okay, we'll come to it. So what I was saying is you will target A or B depending on where it is easy to find a site where a small molecule can bind. In principle, you can target any one of them, but sometimes one of it will be more flexible. It will be more difficult to target. So you have to use your biological knowledge of the system to decide which one is easy to target, or you could try both.
So like
it is a good question, very important.
This like P53 MDM2 inhibitors like RG712 and MI219, they are developed by machine learning or by docking methods?
I won't remember. Most likely they are involved by docking or even it need not have involved. It might have just come from experimental large compound library screening. So we have taken it from the PPIM modulator databases, which are already cataloged there. One has to go to the each paper they would have given the PubMed or the report which reported it. One has to go to that paper to check by which method. It is very less, it is almost unlikely that it is based on machine learning, because machine learning for PPIM or any is being used only recently. It might be from docking, but it may not be, because many of these compounds are also come from screening of large compound libraries, like they screen a few thousand compound and find these are the few hits. So one has to go to the individual paper to find out what is the basis it has come from.
There is another question from Jagdish Chandra. He's saying like, excellent talk, sir. Is there any specific tools for the detection of functionality of different mutant proteins with their inhibitors interactions?
There would be no, see, the functionality of the protein is a very broad question. It will interpret, the interpretation will be different in the different context. So the only thing the tools can tell you, you have a protein, which inhibitors or which molecules can bind there. But so this result only tools can tell. And this result you have to interpret in the context of functionality. The only way you can do is like if somebody has done a large benchmarking, like, okay, he is able to tell, okay, that this is functional. That means what this docking program or the score, if the score is above this, you can say that yes, it will bind and that's why it is functional. So it is again a context specific. There won't be any general tool which can tell you all this.
So I also have one question regarding like the paper which you mentioned lastly. Like there were 25 inhibitors for that interaction between RBD and human ACE2. So whether they have been tested experimentally also, like validated, or like it's just like by ML?
Yes, yes, I'm coming to it. This is a group which, yes, see for the, I'm sorry, just 1 minute.
Yeah.
So this 25 inhibitor, we have also used for training the data. They are experimentally validated. But again, you have to come is it is an in vitro experiment or it is a experiment on the virus. So these are not actually inhibitor experiment. These are more like surface plasmon resonance type of experiment. Like you have in a in vitro system, these two proteins are forming a complex, and in vitro, this molecules are disrupting this interaction. And this is probably, this paper is, I am not sure if it is published now. This was reported by a US group in bioRxiv. In fact, they had several hundred molecules, but we only took some 50 which had good scores, or they in their readout, they found to be high affinity inhibitors for this one. That is how the set 25 has come. But if you go to the entire data set, they are large data set. They are all experimental, but the context of experiment is an in vitro situation. And I am not sure if anybody has taken them and tested it on actually either on a pseudovirus or on a real virus system to check if they are able to inhibit the growth of the virus or things like that. So and not only this data, all the data which is used for training of our machine learning model are experimental. So otherwise, it doesn't make sense to train a model, because if you are taking a prediction data for training, your prediction is already biased by another method and its limitations. So it doesn't help you. It can only give you prediction consistent with that prediction. You could as well directly use that prediction. There is no point in developing a machine learning. So anything you are using for training for your machine learning data should be experimental data.
Thank you. I think Professor Sonika wants to ask.
Yeah, sure.
So Dr. Mohanty has been, of course, part of the field of bioinformatics and computational biology before it was known as bioinformatics and computational biology. And of course, the work that you have outlined over here, using machine learning to select inhibitors of protein-protein interactions, very interesting. But more interesting is, I think, the way that you have criticized your own work and shown the future directions of where this kind of thing is going in the future and where we need to improve. So we need to thank you for making the talk, despite I know that you are not very well, but you accepted my invitation and made the talk. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Dr. Sonika, Yatindra, and other colleagues. Thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk here.
Sir, there is one more question if you can answer.
Sure. You can ask whatever the candidate, the participants are free to ask as many questions as they want.
So, like again, there is question from Dr. Aminul Manan. He says, like, sir, do you have website for your work where you like keep on posting your work?
See, right now the website, which is the link which is given in the briefings in bioinformatics paper, allows you to the only download this program and use it as a script on your Linux machine, and that you can do. But this web version is on our internal server, so because it has to go through the firewall or so, maybe within a month we would try to make it public, because this is developed by students, because you have to go through the institute's firewall, and because like all computers are not accessible outside, so it would be in a couple of months. But the downloadable script, the website is it is just making, if you don't want to take the trouble of installing it on the computer, your website is helping. Otherwise, they're identical script. So if somebody who is interested, you can very easily download it and run with a standard Linux machine would run it. Okay.
Yeah. So one more.
And if you send me you may share with all participants my email. If the person who is asking the question, if maybe I can mail them after we put it on the website if they're interested.
There is one quick question also, like whether MATLAB, can we use MATLAB to screen compounds and identify PPIs using MATLAB, sir? Is it possible?
I am not the MATLAB is a general computing engine. So if MATLAB somebody has already developed a code for predicting and put it in the MATLAB, then only you can use it. So MATLAB has some bioinformatics tools, but it is for specific purpose. So I'm not aware whether MATLAB has any of the docking or that sort of tools in it. But so like MATLAB, more people have for this pathway modeling, because that uses like flux balance and all, uses matrix operations. That is why it is easy to use MATLAB and do this. Whereas for this type of docking or a machine, MATLAB may have machine learning, which I have not used it. So I don't know. So whether it is have for protein-protein interaction inhibitors or not, I don't know. So one has to check. But once the important point to know is, let us say R or MATLAB, these are general purpose tools. Somebody has to use them to write a specific code for the task, then only you can use it. So
I would again like to thank you once again, sir, because like machine learning, like it clearly shows, like it was evident from the graph of ROC curve, like how like the values actually doubled with respect to ROC curve. So it's definitely going to play a major role in the coming time with respect to protein-protein interaction. So we are really thankful to you for taking time out of your busy schedule, and even your like health was not that good. So thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thank you.
So dear participants, we will be meeting at 3:30 for the next session, which is the last session of the day. And let's join at 3:30.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.